Growing up, life was seldom simple. From a family that battled both financial difficulties and, to be honest, with each other, my brother Max and I had very little except each other and a crude knowledge of survival. Though much of his income disappeared into his drug problem, our dad worked at a manufacturing plant. My mother, meantime, was a grocery store cashier. She barely made enough to meet basic costs, and after dealing with nasty clients all day, she usually relaxed with a cheap wine or a joint. Home was often devoid of food, warmth, or comfort. Neither of them was present to mentor or support us. They were too busy fleeing their own reality. On days when I opened the kitchen cabinets in search of something, anything to eat, I would find bare shelves. There were few clean clothes. If you glanced at our supposedly bedroom, all you would find were old stained mattresses on the floor. Every piece of furniture we possessed came from yard sales or items left behind by neighbors. Like me occasionally in my own family, every element of our house was a patchwork of items individuals no longer wanted. You could wonder why no one ever called child services. But where we lived, people were too consumed in their own troubles. Negligent parents were almost the rule in our neighborhood. Max and I saw no one stepping in to save us. The children around us had parents who were either struggling just as hard or harder than ours. We discovered the need to depend on one another as much as to learn to fend for ourselves. Regarding whether or not we attended classes, let alone our performance there, our parents showed no interest. None of that was part of our reality. Basic things like dinner, seeing a doctor when we were sick, or even a hug. My parents battled ceaselessly. It was not merely shouting. Occasionally, it became physical. I would withdraw to my room at that point, trying to muffle the noises of their anarchy. Max would usually accompany me, and we would turn up the level till we could hardly hear each other playing music. Our one means of some quiet and escape was music. Max and I grew close despite all. For those few minutes, we could imagine we were someone else somewhere else. Even when our presence seemed intolerable, he would always urge me to keep my eye on the future. Max looked to have it all. He was driven to break away from the wreckage of our family, head to college, and start a life for himself. Max turned out to be a natural with education. He constantly discussed his ambitions and urged me to follow suit, study, persistence, anything. He was the one child to whom everyone in the congregation began paying attention. Usually merely ignoring us, church members started complimenting my parents for producing such a bright young man. For a family like ours, that type of appreciation was rare, and my parents suddenly felt something they had never experienced: pride. At last, they could boast something. They were first fascinated with one of their children, but just one. This led to favoritism. Years of neglect on whether we even attended school, my parents were suddenly routinely monitoring Max, complimenting his performance and lavishing him with attention. He seemed to have turned into their most valuable item overnight. And to be honest, Max's soaking of it in was not really his fault. Even if it was surface level, I know it felt amazing to have our parents at last show concern for him after years of neglect. But that favoritism started to become darker, something that gradually crept into every aspect of my existence. Mom and Dad started equating me with Max at every point: my grades, my interests, even my leisure time, all of which transformed into a contest I never wanted to be in. Like Max, they would insist I return home straight away to study whenever I tried to meet friends after school. They persuaded me that I would fail if I neglected to spend every second catching up to him. My life now lacked space for my likes, including music or basketball. Every time I tried to resist, they would remind me that I wasn't like Max, and that I wasn't working hard enough. It wasn't Max's fault that he excelled, but the continual comparisons started sapping me. He would still hang out with me initially, still that understanding, supportive brother. But he started to alter as my parents focused increasingly on him. Max began repeating their complaints, advising me to quit whining and increase my effort since, by being demanding, I was simply aggravating my situation. Hearing from him, the one person who used to get it, I started to doubt myself. Our parents' partiality kept growing, and it felt as though I lost my most important ally. Gradually, bitterness developed in ways I never knew how to deal with. Every small gesture they made served as a reminder that Max held greater significance for them. Max could readily ask Dad for new books or school materials whenever he got his money and acquire them without thinking twice. Dad would then tell me to use Max's old belongings when I requested the same things, saying we couldn't afford new items for both of us. With food, Mom would make Max's preferred dishes but wouldn't give a damn whether I even enjoyed what was on the table. Even Max started believing he deserved this particular treatment, and he stopped sticking up for me. To them, I was only a shadow in Max's universe, and the hurt of being so neglected left a mark I couldn't ignore. Growing up, the link we had created was erasing and was replaced with an apparently insurmountable gulf. Except for me, everyone in our family appeared to have a reason to celebrate when Max received a scholarship to a decent institution. Knowing how hard he had worked to get it and how much he dreamed of leaving the house and out of the life we had been living, I was really delighted for him. I was happy for him, since it seemed like all those late evenings he spent learning had paid off. My joy soon waned, though, when I understood that this celebration of my brother's success would simply widen the gulf in our family. Our parents were happy and set out to arrange Max a farewell supper at a restaurant. For us, such an outing was a luxury, a lunch we could not really afford. When I inquired whether I might participate, my mother said, "This is for Max." She said it so apathetically, like I wasn't even there, like I didn't matter in the least. And to further things, Max didn't advocate for me. He simply sat there, relishing in their compliments, without considering me missing out again. I understood he was unique at that very instant. Perhaps he had to be if he were surviving in that family. Still, it stung greatly. After that supper, things at home were strained. When Max left for college, the house felt more empty than it had ever done. Ignoring me like they usually had before Max started performing, my parents returned to their old ways. They had nothing to show the neighbors or to boast about without him present. Every time Max would phone, they would light up, their voices full of vitality, asking him about his classes, friends, or life. They went straight back into their old routine, spending evenings in a fog of smoke and stale beer. Only now I was the one left alone in the silence. Regarding me, though, there was hardly a nod. It was like nothing I would ever do would ever be enough. Even as I started raising my own grades, they would glance at my report card and whisper, "Max did better than this at your age." One night, I overheard them chatting. They had mentally created a line separating him from me, and I was caught on the wrong side no matter how hard I tried. Though they were ignorant of my listening, what I heard that evening will never be forgotten. My mom smiled and said, "Yeah, having only one kid would have been so much easier." My dad was complaining about the past and said, if we had stopped after Max, we could have given him a better life. Hearing them say that they would have been better off without me, was like a gut check. We did not need to. I had always assumed they didn't give me the same kind of attention as they gave Max, but to hear them say it, I started to doubt whether they were right, as I didn't know how to deal with that. Perhaps I was just any average child, the additional child they had not wanted or planned. Perhaps I had no really unique quality at all. Those ideas tore at me, making me mistrust everything and feel a great sense of worthlessness. My usual likes, playing basketball and hanging out with friends, suddenly seemed meaningless. If I were only a burden to my own family, why bother attempting to enjoy life? Then, amid that terrible time, I came across someone who turned everything around. Ben was his name. We met at a weekend hangout among a few mutual friends. Ben belonged among those who seemed to see right past the surface. He stared me squarely in the eyes when we met and remarked, "You've got the saddest eyes I've ever seen." I laughed it off, but that sentence really resonated. Ben and I grew close fast. It was as though he sensed the loneliness my own family had ingrained in me. Though our backgrounds were different and he was from a nicer area than mine, he didn't give a damn about it. From a laid-back friendship, something more evolved. A few weeks later, we went on a date, and for the first time in my life, I felt really understood and cared for. Ben was the first person who listened to me and let me talk without passing judgment or discounting me. He was not only my first actual relationship. With him, I discovered hope, a shred of happiness I hadn't considered feasible, and began pushing myself to create anything out of my existence, I understood I could not be imprisoned in a house that did not feel like home indefinitely. Seeking the grades required for college, I began working more diligently in the classroom. I even worked part-time to attempt to accumulate enough money to move out at last. Leaving that area behind and beginning over free from the shadow of my family's neglect was my dream. Ben was my anchor through all of it, supporting me and telling me I was worth more than they would have ever made me feel. But as my 17th birthday drew near, all changed once more. Sitting me down, my parents advised it was time for me to start paying rent. They wanted their piece since they had seen me saving money and working. They stated they were done helping me since I was now an adult. If I wanted to stay under their roof, I had to pay my way. All of it seemed like a slap in the face. Max had never paid his rent once he turned 18. He had not even been asked. But here I was, advised that I had to find somewhere else to live if I didn't start handing over money. Ben was my lifeline during this experience. He volunteered to let me move in with him and his family when I informed him what was happening. His parents knew enough about my circumstances to relate and were friendly, helpful folks. It was seductive and gave me the kind of affection I hadn't felt in years. Moving in together, though, felt like a major step, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that yet. Although I told Ben I would consider it and thanked him, I finally decided to stay and begin paying my parents' rent. I paid them since I felt caught but wanted to avoid stressing Ben's family more or rushing things with him. I turned up my hard-earned money every month, and on top of that, I frequently found myself paying utilities or groceries while my dad would squander his wages on narcotics. He would conveniently forget to pay the energy bill or buy food, then behave as though he was doing me a favor by allowing me to cover the shortfall. Deeply down, I knew it was manipulative. Then, a few months ago, I received word that turned my life upside down. Max's girlfriend, Lisa, was pregnant. I remained silent, terrified of what would happen if I pushed back. Though they had only been together for a brief period, they suddenly were expecting a baby. Saying they wanted to temporarily move back in until they could save for their own place, Max phoned my folks. He said Lisa's parents wouldn't let her stay with them or support her pregnancy, and rent was too exorbitant for them to handle on their own. Over the moon were my folks. Without even considering it, they agreed. They asked me whether I would be comfortable with it. The following day, my parents informed me they needed me moved out. They intended to turn my room into a nursery for Lisa's son Max. What I was hearing defied belief. They dismissed it when I tried to explain I had nowhere to go, calling me selfish. They were not interested in my still-figuring future or the months of rent payments I'd been making. For them, it was all about Max and their grandchild. Years of feeling like an alien in my own family were being sacrificed to make way for Max. It made no difference if I paid my share and more, or if I had been the one saving things. I phoned Ben since all they saw was an inconvenience, someone to put aside in favor of their golden child. I had no idea what else to do. He urged me to come live with him right away without delay. This time I had nowhere else to go. I had no choice. He loaded all of my stuff into his truck, helped me pack, and as I left, I experienced an odd mix of relief and grief. That house, in spite of all, had been the only one I had known. But standing there, with my bags ready, I understood that leaving was the only path I had ever known to discover a real feeling of serenity. Leaving that place felt like cutting off a bandage on an old, never fully healed sore. Ben loaded his truck, my existence packed into a few bags and boxes. I looked not back as we left. Not able to, though I wanted none of the memories that house carried on. It housed so many. It had been my jail, as much as my house, where I had learned to live silently, invisible. When we got to Ben's house, his parents greeted me warmly. Now, for the first time, I felt like I was beginning something fresh. I had visited them a few times before, but now that I was moving in, they went out of their way to make me feel like I belonged. They treated me like family, inquiring about my day, sincerely interested in my responses in ways my own parents had never seen. They did not treat me like a guest. Ben's mom helped me sort and arrange the area they had set aside for me. Being in a house where people really cared for one another, where supper was on the table every night, and where laughter permeated the rooms felt unusual at first. This kind of comfort, this quiet constancy, was not something I was used to. Changing required time. There were times when I felt uncomfortable, as though I was invading something that wasn't rightfully hers. I would find myself pausing, as though the solace surrounding me was fleeting, as though someone would tell me I did not belong there after all. But Ben was there, consistent as always, reminding me with every word and gesture that I was protected. On evenings when I could sleep, he would stay up with me and listen to me rant about my parents, early years, questions, etc. Someone who wanted to listen. Someone who didn't only tolerate me but really cared about what I had to say. Someone I never had someone to chat with like that. While Max and Lisa moved into my former room just as my parents had intended, I couldn't believe I had discovered someone who valued me and who gave me significance. Given that I had left the house solely so they could have a place for their new family, I reasoned perhaps just maybe Max would check in on me and see how I was doing. But the call arrived weeks later, and when he did get back in touch, it was not out of concern. Max was seeking justification for everything. He dismissed my emotions, claiming that allowing his family room was a small sacrifice on my side, that I was exaggerating and had to grow up. Stung more than I would have wanted to acknowledge the words. When I told him how unjust it all felt and how our parents had always put him above me, he rejected it, saying I was just envious and behaving immature. It seemed as though he had become a whole different person, one who saw me as an annoyance instead of his sister. Something within me cracked at that point. I understood that my dream for a reconciliation of our relationship was lost. Max was too far into their world, too enmeshed in their partiality, to ever view events from my point of view. Though losing him hurt, I knew I had to let him go. Living with Ben's family was comforting, but it also served as a reminder of everything I had lost growing up. I had to concentrate on my own life, on healing and forward motion, no matter how much it hurt to leave the final piece of my family behind. His parents were lovely, helpful folks who made great effort to make me comfortable. They urged me to keep striving toward my objectives and gave me a comfortable, steady place to land. Still, I wanted not to rely on them always. I redoubled my attention to my studies, driven by a fresh goal. Working hard, saving every bit of money I could from my part-time job, and starting applications to universities, I was resolved to prove that I was more than just the extra kid, to create something of myself. 3 months passed, and things seemed to be at last beginning to settle. I was carefully laying my road to independence. Then suddenly, though, my phone began to flash missed calls from my mother. Having never contacted me once since I moved out, seeing her name show up so many times felt odd, almost threatening. Curiosity won me over during my lunch break, and at last I phoned her back. She seemed agitated and her voice trembled. Max and Lisa had gone out in the middle of the night, gathering their belongings and vanishing without a word, she told me. Their note said they were done with our parents. Though startled, a tiny bit of me couldn't help but feel somewhat satisfied. Years of having Max on a pedestal, my parents treated him as though he were untouchable. Mom then went on to say that having Max and Lisa live with them had become a nightmare. He had lately left on them. Lisa's pregnant appetites drove her to eat non-stop, and my parents had no idea how much the extra costs would strain their already limited means. Max objected, claiming he could live rent-free, when they requested Lisa and Max to cover groceries. That dispute had apparently become ugly quickly. My mom had even dubbed Lisa a freeloader, which set things ablaze until Max decided to leave. Later, she told me the reason she was phoning. She wanted me to come back home. Especially after they had forced me out so subtly to make way for Max's family. I questioned her why she would even believe I would contemplate it. She advised me that if I moved back in, I could help with expenses and rent. She even advised I might sleep on the couch since they had converted my previous room into a nursery already. I stopped because of its sheer ridiculousness and nearly laughed. I took a deep breath and gently told her, cool-headed, I wouldn't be coming back after all the suffering they had put me through, simply because their golden child had left them stranded. They had chosen, I informed her, and now they were dealing with the results. I told her I deserved better than being treated like some backup plan, and that they would have been more than happy to ignore me whenever it would fit them. She attempted to argue to make me feel bad, but for the first time I let it pass me by. When I hung up, I felt a weird sensation of relief, like a weight had been taken off. I told her I was done with the cycle of hurt and favoritism that had defined my upbringing. I felt no shame about having at last established a distance from my parents. Ben was encouraging through it all, so reassuring me that I had made the correct decision. For once, I felt as though I was in charge of my own life and making decisions appropriate for me rather than for anyone else. After they had treated me, he told me I deserved a fresh start, and I owed nothing to his family. Those words provided the last bit of fortitude I required to permanently close that chapter of my life. Having his help, I pushed myself into my college applications and gave everything I had into creating the future I wanted for myself. In a sense, being kicked out of my parents' house had been a gift. It made me flee a poisonous circumstance and muster the will to lead my own life. Living with Ben and his family let me see what an honest, loving, and unwavering family might look like. Though I never imagined I would have, I was resolved to keep hold of this life. Deciding not to go back to my parents' house, I had an exciting and terrible independence. For so long, I had been caught in their cycle of favoritism and neglect, bound to their expectations. I was free to live for myself, to discover who I was and where I wanted to go, now for the first time. Though I had no idea exactly what that looked like, Ben at my side prepared me to push forward. College was my first target, an opportunity to escape the patterns my parents had tried to lock me in. Every free time I threw myself into applications, essay writing and revising, compiling references, and school research. I was resolved to find somewhere that would bring me one step toward a life on my terms. Ben was my support through it all. He helped me edit essays, checked in on me during late-night study sessions, and gave me the encouragement I had never gotten growing up. A few weeks later, I received the news I had been waiting for, an admission letter to a nearby college. I recall clutching that letter in my hands, almost unable to keep my emotions under control. This was my opportunity, my haven from the life I had always known. I was going to at last create something of myself. Ben hugged me tightly and reported his pride when I told him. Standing there in his arms, I knew none of this would have been possible without him and the help he had provided me. Finding a place to live was the next major step. Not because of rejection, but rather because I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet. I wanted to leave Ben's place. It was time for me to begin creating a life really unique to me. Thanks to Ben, I began apartment hunting. Though I had little means from my part-time employment, I had enough saved, and with some luck, I came upon a little apartment I could afford with a roommate. It was not much, just a small area close to the university, but to me, it felt like the start of a completely new chapter. Moving into that flat was like crossing a river. I was walking into a space all mine, leaving behind the hurt of my past, poisonous family relationships, and Sarah, my roommate, was beginning her first year of college as well, and we bonded right away over our mutual excitement and anxiety about moving in together. For the first time, I was living alone, accountable for my own bills, my own meals, and my own choices. She had a friendly, easygoing attitude that made the apartment seem pleasant, like a place I could really relax and be myself. Every difficulty, from learning to cook to budgeting, was a step toward recovering my life. It wasn't always simple. Some nights I would feel the weight of everything falling on me and wonder if I was strong enough to do it alone. Every time those uncertainties surfaced, though, I would recall the years of struggle I had gone through and the distance I had traveled from my parents' house. I kept in touch with Ben, of course. Those memories were my fuel, my reminder that I had endured worse and that I was stronger than I ever thought. He was my lighthouse, the guy who had guided me out of the shadows, even though we were separated. We would have long chats about our futures and study sessions, and even though we were no longer living together, our relationship was as solid as it had been. Ben was the one constant in my life, the reminder that love neither had to be used as a negotiating tool nor come with strings attached. As I settled into college life, I started making new friends. People who weren't my second child or lesser sibling, who saw me for who I was, who valued my mind, my compassion, and my resilience. Surrounded by individuals who actually cared about me, I felt for the first time as part of something greater. My universe was growing, and with every new encounter, I felt bits of my past wearing away like old skin I no longer required. Then, just when I thought I would have finally put everything behind, my brother Max reached out. Said the least, it was surprising. Since he and Lisa moved out of my parents' house, we hadn't kept in touch, and part of me wanted not to hear from him. But something inside urged me to give him an opportunity to be heard. Max began by apologize. He told me how he had at last recognized the truth about our parents, the favoritism, the manipulation, the way he had been used as a pride symbol while discarding me. He said it had opened his eyes and helped him to see just how much I had gone through when Lisa suffered under their observation. He said he was sorry for not being by me, for discounting my suffering, for being so preoccupied with their praise that he had left me when I most needed him. It was difficult to forgive him, and I told him as much. His remarks were honest and raw, and for the first time, I could hear real regret in his voice. My own family had made me feel so little, so I couldn't simply ignore the years of hurt and the evenings I'd wept myself to sleep. Hearing him admit my suffering, though, and hear him declare he at last understood, was like a weight lifting off my chest. Max and I began to gently rebuild our friendship, like two strangers finding common ground. It did not erase the past, but rather made me less alone, like someone else finally understood what I had gone through. Though it never would be perfect, our shared knowledge of our parents' brokenness had some beneficial impact. Though he had been their favorite, he now realized the harm that partiality had done. We both knew that the family we had been born into was defective. In a sense, we were both victims caught in a web of expectations and neglect that had molded us in ways we were still discovering. My friendship with Max got closer in the next few months. We would check in with one another and discuss our aspirations and future. He said he wanted to offer his child the love and encouragement we had both missed out on, and he was resolved to be a better father than our own. And for me, I came to see I had no need to continue bearing the weight of the past. About my parents, I kept my distance. I could decide to let it go, to forgive, not for their benefit but for mine. Usually when they needed anything or when the weight of Max's absence knocked them down, they called periodically. But since they would never change, I had already found serenity. They had decided their road. I had decided mine. I felt not bad about establishing limits, about preserving my peace for once. I had fashioned a life free from their expectations, their favoritism, and their neglect. The freedom I felt was a type of calm I had never known. People who really loved me, who saw me for who I was, not as an afterthought or a hassle, surrounded me. My new buddies, Ben and Sarah, had grown to be my family, one that loved me without conditions. And step by step, I understood as I progressed that the suffering of my past defined no more of me. With every decision I took, I was recovering my story, something fresh and personal. I was no more simply a shadow in the life of someone else, the second kid, the lost daughter. I was me, tough, tenacious, and at last really free. By the time my second year of college started, my life had changed to reflect something I never would have imagined. I had laid a strong foundation with friendships, a bright academic future, and a deep, relentless love for Ben. I had made my own road far apart from the terrible roots I left behind. Though it still ached in quiet times and far-off memories, it no longer defined me. Living on my own had its difficulties, but each one seemed like a victory. I was transcending it and forging a future based on my own power. How to budget every dollar, cook from scratch, and manage tasks once would have overwhelmed me. Knowing that I could stand on my 2 feet gave me great empowerment, and as my confidence grew, I felt my history slip away and replace a quiet, tranquil resiliency. I shed the weight of wondering why I hadn't been sufficient for my parents. Rather, I concentrated on what I could become for myself. Ben was by my side at every turn, and as our relationship grew, we started discussing our future together more seriously. He had evolved from my first love to my partner, someone I could really picture living with. In him, I had discovered a steadiness and love I had never known. Max and I kept in touch as well, though our relationship was cautious and slow, like negotiating a road that was both known and strange. He was my family in every meaning of the term, not because of blood, but because of choice, trust, and respect. We understood each other that although our common experiences had molded us, we were no longer the kids we used to be. Max had assumed accountability for his prior behavior, which meant something. Our talks were honest, sometimes brutal, and I started to view him more as someone who had battled in his own manner than as the brother who had once turned away from me. Trapped, too, on the other side of the family's fracturedness, he had been together. We focused on healing from the animosity that had formerly split us, as well as from the neglect of our parents. Despite these little advances with Max, I kept my distance from my parents. Though it was obvious their inquiry wasn't born from worry, they contacted sometimes, mainly to ask news about Max or to probe my life. I answered succinctly, and I stopped the discussion whenever they tried to guilt-trip me or bring up the past. The strict limits I had set to guard myself replaced the power they once possessed over me. I did not want to seek validation from past hurts or reopen them. As my third year of college drew near, I started to consider my future. I was at peace with who I was, and I no longer required their permission. Passionate in social work, I wanted to use my background to assist children raised in circumstances similar to mine. I wanted to be someone Ben had seen, someone who could see the suffering in their eyes, someone who could guide them out. It was a calling, a means of giving back, and perhaps even a chance for me to heal the part of me that had felt so invisible, not only a job objective. Though I knew the road ahead would be difficult, I had weathered storms before and so understood suffering was not unusual. This time, I had a goal. Ben and I used to discuss our dreams and how we may help one another to bring them to pass. Working in environmental science would allow him to help cure a planet like mine. One afternoon, as we sat on the couch in my little apartment, Ben turned to me and said, "You're the strongest person I know." Our plans were flexible, but we both knew we wanted to create something together. A life anchored in kindness, resiliency, and love. I grinned, a warmth radiating through me, since at last I felt you really are very amazing. Though I knew my road had not been simple, each step had taken me closer to realizing the person I was supposed to be. As the years passed, I grew more and more confident in my independence, decisions, and relationships. My voice, path, and peace found expression. Though we both kept our distance from our parents, Max and I stayed in touch. I kept on my social work courses, dived into internships, volunteered, and finally worked with kids from homes like mine. Though often full of tales reflecting my own, it was challenging work with value. From a child left in the shadows to someone who could be a lighthouse for others, my path had come full circle, and each time I connected with a youngster who felt alone, I provided them a bit of hope and felt a bit of my own past heal. Along the road, I'd come to embrace the love I had discovered, learn to let go of the hurt, and forgive without forgetting. My life was now my own, molded not by the family I had been born into, but by the decisions I had taken and the people who really loved me. At last, I was free from constraints based on the past. I was free to design a future marked by strength, love, and purpose. And I knew that I would carry this tranquility with me, always like a gentle, steady flame that could never be extinguished, even as I excited about the path ahead.